It's my pleasure to have back on Bad Faith podcast Dr. James Zogby. He is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, an author, a journalist, former deputy campaign manager to the Jesse Jackson campaigns, and importantly, for the sake of this conversation, Democratic National Committee member for 31 years, including 16 years on the executive committee. Welcome back, Dr. Zogby.
Thank you.
All right. So this is the $64,000 question. There is a lot of speculation about what might happen, the possibility of a brokered convention or an open convention. But I want to really be speaking specifically about the logistics of if what we've all been speculating about is really possible, and if so, how it would work. So could you start by sort of introducing us to the concept of what an open convention would look like, and then maybe get into your most recent piece that I read in Common Dreams, explaining why you think that's the path we should go down?
Well, what it would look like is a really exciting convention like conventions of old. 1960 John Kennedy, where, delegates, what it would be? Actually, it'd be the Iowa caucuses on steroids. There'd be a caucusing, a lot of deal making, a lot of activity on the floor. And for the first time in decades, the networks would be covering the convention rather than covering themselves, covering the convention, where the anchors talk to each other in endless. You don't hear the speeches, you hear the networks telling you this is what you're hearing right now. The conventions have gotten so predictable and so scripted that there's no interest. And so instead of wall-to-wall coverage like it was when I was a kid, and I'm old, they cover them from 1, maybe 2 hours a night. This would be a convention where people would go, nominations would be made from the floor. We would have had a month or so of a mini primary. We'd know who the candidates are. They'd be nominated, they'd give their speeches, and the voting would begin. And we might need a couple of ballots. I don't know. I think the vice president would probably win on the first ballot. But nevertheless, there'd be a debate about issues on the floor, and having followed a month of debate of the candidates with each other. And I think the American people deserve that. I think the Democratic Party deserves that. And I think Vice President Harris deserves it. People have criticized me for saying, well, she had the right to just, whatever, succeed. I say that's not good for her, and it's not good for the party. It would energize everyone to see democracy in action, and that's what I'd like to see.
So I really take your point about the benefit to, frankly, the Democratic Party or to the policies that many of the listeners in the show support, even if they don't support the Democratic Party, having an opportunity to get those front and center. I have been saying for months and months now, maybe even over a year now, that I think the Republicans have really benefited from having a real primary in which, despite me personally finding most of their ideas very objectionable, they had an opportunity to vet them and wrestle with them in front of the American public. And I think there, frankly, is more of an awareness of not only what the Republican candidate has on offer. He obviously didn't participate in those debates, but more broadly speaking, what Republicans have on offer and the distinctions they make between themselves and Democrats. There has been no similar opportunity on the Democratic side of the aisle. And I do think there would be a benefit of that. But practically speaking, can you walk us through what would have to happen with the delegates? Because as I understand it, the delegates are pledged and required to vote for Joe Biden, and that he secured back in March, I think, the magic number of delegates required to secure the nomination.
With, I would add, a minimal number of voters participating. There was very little turnout. I mean, the other thing of not having a real primary is that people just don't go. And we're looking at polls and we're seeing a lack of enthusiasm even for November, despite the fact that this is an Armageddon election. I mean, if Trump wins, it could be conceivably the end of democracy. I fear even if he loses, the violence that may ensue. But even with that, we're finding when we ask voters, are you enthusiastic about this election? Too many Democrats say no. Are you likely to vote? Too many Democrats say no. So, look, what has to happen to start is that Joe Biden has to say, I'm stepping aside. It can't happen without him agreeing to that.
Because otherwise the pledged delegates are in fact pledged. There's no possibility for just a defection.
Not only that, but no one is going to walk over him on the way to nobody's going to do it. It would have to be, he'd have to agree. And I think that as pressure builds from members of Congress, from people, especially in competitive races, as we get one more drip, drip, drip of the press. Jackson used to call the press alligators smelling blood in the water. And frankly, they're smelling the blood in the water. And so every day is another story, maybe 2 or 3 stories about he said this or he meant to say that, or look at his health, whatever. We don't need to go between now and November with that being the daily story. The story needs to be Donald Trump's a danger to the world, a danger to America. And Democrats have ideas to offer to counter that. But we won't get that message through if the focus keeps being on this. So if he says, I step down, my memo to the party was, you should have a plan moving forward. The plan shouldn't just be handed off to Vice President Harris. It should be, let's have an organized, competitive, compressed primary to get us to the convention. So here's what I propose is that DNC members, of whom there are 440 something, would be asked to sign petitions nominating their favorite candidates. The candidates would do what you always do when you go to the county central committee or the state central committee to nominate yourself. You get the endorsements of X number of people. I would think 40 DNC members, representing each of the 4 regions of the party so that they weren't just from their one state, would submit. The party secretary would certify. A week from now, the campaign would begin. Candidates would go to different parts of the country to speak. They'd go on television. There'd be a lot of media interest, no doubt. And the party would sponsor 2 town halls at which the candidates would be asked the same kinds of questions. Why are you best qualified for this? What is your vision for the country, et cetera? What do you think about healthcare reform? What do you think? We'd have the issues laid out.
Sure.
And then you'd go to the convention, and the convention would begin with the candidates being nominated, speeches being given, and then the floor vote. And it would be, the great state of Arkansas says whatever. And then, if no candidate got a majority, you'd go to a second ballot. And on a second ballot, like the Iowa caucuses, the horse trading would begin with this one dropping out and endorsing that one. There's no way to victory for me, so I'm going to endorse such and such. And what would happen would be, for the first time in most people's lifetimes, not mine because I'm old, we would see actually politics happening at a convention, as opposed to being a highly scripted, predictable affair that nobody really watches or cares about because you know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, I really agree with the points made about the energy it would inject into the process on the side of Democrats, again, after having a lot of that energy on the Republican side because there was a primary. And I really also take your point that there was no Democratic primary. You're seeing a lot of people argue right now. I think Jamie Harrison came forward and said, we had a primary, a candidate was picked. Doing anything other than going forward with Joe Biden is implicitly kind of undermining the will of the people. But as we've heard so many pundits and prognosticators say, including very famously Simone Sanders in a clip that has gone viral many times around, there will be no primary.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. doing well. He's at 19%. Hasn't really gotten that much out there. I mean, and I'm starting to hear more and more talk about him. Are we going to actually have a challenge here?
I'm trying not to laugh, Joe. There's not going to be.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Do you know how many people said the same thing about Donald Trump in 2015 on this show?
Except I will
the
note,
same exact thing.
Yes, because there was going to be a Republican primary. But I really think that the mealy-mouthed Democrats, as I like to call them, and some of my progressive friends who would like to live in a fantasy land, they need to come back to reality. Yeah. And the reality is this. The sitting president of the United States of America is a Democrat that would like to run for re-election, so much so that he has declared a re-election campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. There will be no debate stage for Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson, or anyone else to stand on.
So we're going to have another Bobby Kennedy in an empty chair in the debate, right?
There will be no debate.
Yeah, no debate.
The Democratic National Committee administers the debates, and they're not going to set up a primary process for debates for someone to challenge the head of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
There was no primary. There was a a complete blackout on Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, and I think a great deal of pressure on what the Democratic Party would consider quote unquote more serious candidates to not actually enter the race.
The minute they passed the resolution at the DNC meeting that I opposed to get rid of Iowa and New Hampshire and start with South Carolina, the fix was in. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to make it, because look, if you look at history, Iowa and New Hampshire are the states that favor insurgencies. Why? Because candidates get to go there and spend a year going to everything from county fairs to backyard barbecues to sitting in luncheonettes to going to churches, to going to synagogues and mosques. I mean, they just meet everybody. And people in those states, I mean, well, there was a lot of bad rap that Iowa's white and New Hampshire's white and whatever. I mean, I've been to black churches with Jackson in Iowa. I've been to barbecues with Jackson in Iowa. And I've seen people look the candidate in the eye and ask tough questions and get the measure of the person. That doesn't happen in a national campaign like the one we just had. What happens is that you get speeches in auditoriums, but you don't get to see and talk to the folks in person. We didn't really have a primary, is what is my point. We kind of had a coronation. Yeah. We don't need another one. And as to your previous question, the minute Joe Biden says, I'm not running, he would release his candidates and their pledges no longer, those who are pledged to him or ran on his slate no longer are bound to do so anymore. So that would happen right away.
Yeah. So your point about Iowa, I just want to pick up on that. I remember Iowa's maybe only 10% or so non-white, but I remember Bernie did very well and basically won all of those voters back in 2020 because there was a real focus on staffers going to the turnover shifts at the meatpacking plants in Iowa, where they overwhelmingly use immigrant labor, a lot of East Africans and Latinos there. And my understanding is that part of why we were so successful in the caucuses, and when you look at the kind of caucus picture of, people literally going to stand in a corner of the room to vote, it is an incredibly diverse group of people standing in the Bernie corner of the room as compared to some other corners of the room that were empty and not diverse. I remember one stunning image in particular of Warren's corner having one young white voter standing there with, Warren t-shirt or what have you. And then this real diverse, economically diverse, racially diverse group in Bernie's corner. And the media completely was disinterested in that. And they said insane things like, we got to wait till a diverse state actually votes, excluding the overwhelming victory that Bernie had in Nevada, where he won 70% of the Latino vote. And now the Democratic Party is dealing with the issue of how on earth do we attract Latinos who are fleeing at kind of record numbers. But I just want to just drill down on this. In your plan, you mentioned that you like the idea of Democratic committee members that are kind of regionally diverse nominating candidates. Can you talk me through that reasoning? Because I could see a situation where, because of the kind of establishment nature of the members of the committee, you end up getting selections that don't reflect some of the issues that have been really motivating discontent with Biden, including the war in Gaza.
Look, I can't take issue with that. I mean, I think that the war in Gaza probably impacts grassroots voters, Democrats in particular, more than it does anyone in any elective position. But let's take a look at the Democratic National Committee, because they get a bum rap. I mean, most of these folks on the Democratic National Committee are elected in their states. They're elected national committee people. They're elected state chairs. They're elected in many cases on the grassroots level. And there are some who are appointed by the chair. There are some, but it's like 75 of the 400 and something members. And so I've met some pretty extraordinary people over the years. And remember, of when we had the election between Perez and Keith Ellison, it was a split. It was like 211 to 210 on the first ballot, something like it was very close. For Keith Ellison, there was a huge Bernie vote. There's a lot of Bernie delegates still on the DNC. And so it is a more diverse group of people than one would politically and also racially and ethnically than one would expect. I think that it's the only vehicle we have to do this work legally, because the Democratic National Committee is supposed to be the governing body of the party. Now, this has been my gripe, is that I've been on for 31 years. And when I first got on, a very good friend of mine, Rob Stein, who was Ron Brown's chief of staff, I went and talked to him about it. He said, first thing you have to know is that the DNC is not the governing body. There is no governing body. They've never acted in that capacity. I said, but I read the bylaws and I read the articles, the bylaws and articles of incorporation of the DNC. It's supposed to be the decision-making body. He said, I know that that's what it's supposed to be, but they usually aren't. And somebody used the comparison of the Bulgarian Communist Party 1955. They gather, but you're told what to say, you're told what to do, you're told how to vote, and nobody wants to step out of the lines, because there's a sense of just getting along and going along with whatever's done. I've wanted to see the Democratic Party actually become a Democratic Party. When Keith Ellison ran against Tom Perez, in the 30-something years I've been on the DNC, that was the only time we had an election for chair. Every other time the meeting and we're told this is the guy we're going to vote for and it's done. There had been people running against the chair, but by the time you got to the meeting, they were talked out of running and you only had one person to vote for. At that same meeting, we had a vote on the floor and a debate on the floor as to whether or not the party would accept money from corporate PACs. Guess what? We debated it on the floor. That was the first time in all the years I'd been on the DNC that we debated an issue on the floor and then had a vote on it. So we need to democratize the Democratic Party. And this would be a start at it, empowering the Democratic National Committee to not just say yes, but to actually say, I support this candidate, you support that candidate, let's debate about it, which is what people expect us to do. And I think that the folks I know would rather energetically get involved in that process. There'd be the Kamala people, there'd be the Shapiro or the Pritzker people or the Cory Booker people, and we'd have a hell of a debate, I think, over issues and over the character of the candidates. There are some in the party who get nervous about that. It's like, why? It'd be chaos, I frankly, having 5 kids and 13 grandkids, I'm never afraid of chaos. If we all agree on one thing, that we want to win, then let the many voices speak. Let people feel empowered. It would be a huge difference.
Yeah. Dr. Zogby, I was reading some coverage. Obviously, there's a lot of articles speculating about what's going to happen and about what level of pressure exists from Democratic officials coming out to say Joe Biden should step down. Immediately after his debate performance, it was, frankly, to me, surprising how open the dams were and how immediately every Democratic pundit that had spent years saying that there was nothing to see here with respect to Biden's cognitive fitness was suddenly being very honest about what we all saw on the stage. There was some, circling of the wagons after that. But then following the George Stephanopoulos interview a couple of days ago, there did seem to be more concerns articulated. People like Rob Reiner, who are steadfast kind of celebrity supporters of the president, have started to say it's time for him to step down. That being said, reading some of the articles about the likelihood of that happening seem to be cutting both ways. I read one in CNN that was published, I believe, yesterday on July 8th, titled Democratic Convention Delegates Say They're Loyal to Biden and Bulk at Other Options. I also saw Prim Tucker over at The Intercept tweeting out basically a message from one delegate who basically said, no way, Jose, is this happening? And I want to get more into specifically what that person said. But I do want to get to what was something that was kind of referenced or alluded to in the CNN article, that Biden had done really good work to vet the delegates and make sure that they were loyal. That to me suggests there's a world where even though these delegates are officially pledged and cannot on the first round of voting vote for anybody other than who won the election in their states, who they're pledged to, the idea that it would matter if they were particularly loyal or not suggests to me that there is the possibility for people to go rogue. Am I reading that right? Or am I misunderstanding what's going on there?
There are delegates who are, in some cases, you actually run on a line. Like here in the district, when I ran as a Jackson delegate, I didn't run simply under Jackson's name. I ran separately. I had to run as a Jackson delegate and get signatures, et cetera, to qualify, and then run citywide. In some states, the candidate wins, and he's told how many delegates he gets, and then he picks the delegates, and they simply are ratified by either the county or whatever, the multiple ways in different states as to how this is done. But those who actually run or are appointed by the candidate and sign a pledge to the candidate, they're bound on the first ballot. They are bound. In other states, if you run and win on your own, even though you indicate you're for this candidate, you may not be pledged on the first ballot. So there are possibilities that some go rogue, but not enough to make a huge difference here. And then there always was the issue of the elected officials and the DNC members who are mostly not pledged. They could vote the way they want, but I doubt seriously that they would. I did sign my thing. I sent it into the secretary, saying that I was going to the convention, that I was going as uncommitted, and they, I might have gotten an eye roll for that, but what the hell, it's like that's where I am. You got the eye roll.
Well, there's worse things than there's worse things than an eye roll. Well,
but here's the thing: is that I think that given the nature of the selection process, I am sure that the Biden team looked through the people that they were picking, and they were giving to donors, they were given to people who've worked hard, in many cases people who know the president or know people in the campaign, and the campaign said, this is a good guy, this is a great lady, whatever, let's do. I mean, these are people known. So they are going to be 95% of the delegates at the convention are going to be Biden picked delegates, the campaign picked delegates. I don't expect them to go rogue, but I do expect that if they're released, then they'll still vote pretty much the way the campaign would ask them to, although they wouldn't. They'd be voting their conscience, not bound to vote in a certain way.
Let me read you this message from a DNC delegate to Prim Tucker at The Intercept. They wrote, "I've come to the determination that I cannot support President Biden at the convention, that ABC News interview made evident he's not committed to improving the party's chances of defeating Trump, which suspending his campaign would allow us to do."
Was this a bad episode or the sign of a more serious condition?
It was a bad episode. No indication of any serious condition. I was exhausted. I didn't listen to my instincts in terms of preparing, and I had a bad night.
You say you were exhausted, and I know you've said that before as well, but you came, and you did have a tough month, but you came home from Europe about 11 or 12 days before the debate, spent 6 days in Camp David. Why wasn't that enough rest time, enough recovery time?
Because I was sick. I was feeling terrible. Matter of fact, the docs with me, I asked them, they did a COVID test because they were trying to figure out what was wrong. They did a test to see whether or not I had some infection, a virus. I didn't. They just had a really bad cold.
And did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
Well, what I want to get at is, what were you experiencing as you were going through the debate? Did you know how badly it was going?
Yeah, look, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault, mine. Nobody's fault but mine. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down, as I did come back with foreign leaders or the National Security Council, for explicit detail. And I realized about partway through that, I get quoted, the New York Times had me down at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. The fact of the matter is that what I looked at is that he also lied 28 times. The way the debate ran, not my fault, nobody else's fault. No one else's fault.
But it seemed like you were having trouble from the first question in, even before he spoke.
Well, I just had a bad night.
given the state of the race, I would assert that every delegate has an obligation to our party and our nation to cast their vote for someone better positioned to take on Donald Trump, an obligation that supersedes our obligation as pledged Biden delegates. Personally, I will be casting my vote for Vice President Harris. Based on some conversations with fellow delegates, I am confident that a significant number of delegates will be willing to break ranks if it means preventing Trump from returning to the White House. People think all the delegates are Biden loyalists. Some are, but most aren't. Speaking for myself, my loyalty is to Democratic values, not a single candidate. What do you make of that?
Well, I couldn't disagree with his intent. I mean, that should be this is not Joe Biden's party. This is a party of Democrats who support Joe Biden or decide not to support Joe Biden. I mean, it ought to be an independent organization. The problem is that over the years that I've been in this, I've seen the parties reduced to being cheering squads for whoever's in the White House. That's not what we should be, number one. Number two, whether or not that person is able on the first ballot to break ranks is I'm not sure, because I don't know the conditions under which said person was elected. He may not have the option of voting not for Joe Biden, and we'll see. I don't know.
Just so I understand this, and I'm sorry to be obtuse about this, but this whole process is really mysterious to me, and I think it probably is to a lot of listeners as well. Even if a delegate were to have run specifically committing to Joe Biden, even if they had been kind of vetted and supported by Joe Biden in that process, is there anything that actually prohibits them? If I'm just saying, I understand that it's unlikely because they were selected and kind of groomed for that role, but is there anything structurally prohibiting them from breaking ranks? Because I'm asking this question because this anonymous quote from Prem seems to suggest breaking ranks in exactly that sort of way. And that it's not just this individual who's anonymous, who says that they would be willing to do so, but that they have spoken to a non-trivial number of others who feel the same way. So would they be allowed to, even if they were pledged?
May not even have the option to do it, is the point. In other words, is that if they ran on their own, that's one thing. But if they didn't run, but were actually appointed by the Biden campaign after the primary process was over and they got X number of slots and they designated these were the people who would get them, and are pledged to do so, he may have already signed a pledge, in which case he never gets the option to vote on the floor because the party already has the list. And in order to avoid any embarrassment, they've decided to pre-record the votes of the states, which I think is absolutely horrendous, to do these video captions of, and the great state of Alaska casts all of its, that kind of thing. It may already be a done deal. So said person won't get the opportunity to do so. If I'm not mistaken, most of the states have already sent out to their delegates, tell us who you're voting for, or they already know who they're voting for because they were pledged and they were assigned by the campaigns. So it may not even be an option here.
Okay, so this is why you keep coming back to the idea that none of this goes forward unless Joe Biden
says I'm not running,
releases delegates. Okay, so I did also want to ask you about the question of Palestine that does seem to be very much looming, but not discussed. I was listening to a pod save, or rather their kind of sister podcast, The Wilderness, that recently did an episode about what's going on with young voters and why they're so politically disaffected, and why polls are suggesting that larger numbers of voters under 30 are going to vote Republican than ever. I think Trump is winning the majority of like the Gen Z vote, which seems kind of incredible to think about. I understand that was a relatively small sample size from a larger poll. I'm sorry?
I haven't seen that. I've seen a winning. Yeah, I've seen disaffected among that age group, but not Republican.
I'll look it up while we're talking. This is from a month or so ago, before I was fired from Rising. But I do remember being really shocked by how many young voters seem to be willing to vote for Republicans right now. And I don't think it's about Donald Trump. I think it's largely about what the Democratic Party isn't offering. But as they were kind of interviewing young voters and talking to them about what their interests and concerns were, student debt, all these other kinds of things, in the audio clips of the young voters, they kept bringing up Palestine.
Mhm.
And in the conversation, Palestine kept kind of getting yada yada'd over. And I wanted to bring this up because it does seem to me that there is a concern among some voters that the Democratic Party might be able to slot in an alternate candidate. Maybe it's Kamala Harris, maybe it's Gavin Newsom, who knows, but who would be able to have some credible distance from what the administration policy has been in Gaza without representing an actual meaningful change from that policy in a way that could take the air out of the movement, as it were. And The Intercept wrote this article up, quoting a voter saying something very similar. They said, I think it would be a big mistake for the Democratic Party to switch gears, but stay the course in this particular issue, Gaza, that has galvanized so many people in an unprecedented way in the primaries and who continue showing up and trying to advocate to be heard in a system that is continuing, they feel, to ignore him. That was Hala Ahmad, a policy analyst and spokesperson with Listen to Wisconsin, the state's uninstructed campaign. So they called theirs uninstructed as opposed to uncommitted. Do you have any concerns about that?
Number one, Hiba worked for me for a couple of years, and she's just marvelous young woman, great organizer. Number two, I think that Gaza, look, you said the current policy, which actually amounts to enabling genocide. I mean, that's what it is, and that's what people are seeing and feeling, and have been absolutely horrified by it. But I want to put Gaza in context, because what has struck me about what's happening here with Gaza and with young people's reaction to Gaza is that it comes at a sort of as the latest iteration of an issue that has been galvanizing young people intersectionally. Began with, if you would, the Women's March, the March for Our Lives, the against guns, the Muslim ban. I mean, there have been a number of forms, and then obviously the Black Lives Matter after George Floyd, where we saw maybe for the first time, I think in all of these cases, a huge diversity of young people coming out. I mean, I remember when the George Floyd demonstrations were taking place here in the district. I never saw so many white kids demonstrating against police violence before. On Gaza, I remember when I started Palestinian work, the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in '76, we'd go in front of the White House and it would be, Carter, you should know, we support the BLO. It was all Arab. And it was all a lot of immigrant Arab. But the kids who are doing it and taking the lead right now are all over the place. And it's extraordinary. And so what is happening is not so much, I mean, yes, look at Gaza, which is a nightmare, but it's been a nightmare for decades, although the genocide certainly is the nightmare on steroids. But there is a consciousness among young people that is fundamentally different than other age cohorts. My brother, John, calls them the first globals. They have a global awareness of the world. They know places that older cohorts don't know. They cry over Darfur. They think about the Uyghurs. They know what's happening to the environment. They feel it in their bones, and they act. And so what's interesting is that, yes, Joe Biden is losing a number of people in this age cohort. They're not going to Donald Trump. They're just not going to vote, or they're going to vote third party. And I include among them young, obviously Arabs, no doubt, but also Black, Latino, Asian, progressive Jews, and actually white people in general, young people in general. So that there is a distinct consciousness among that age cohort that I think has to be understood, that I don't think the politicians are understanding. And frankly, if Democrats don't win them, it's hard for them to win in November. There are a number of groups we have to win, but young people are absolutely critical to a Democratic victory, as are Black voters essential to a Democratic victory, and Michigan, as are Arab voters essential to a Democratic victory, as are white working class ethnic voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin that we pay no attention to at all. Call them deplorable, and I think what was great about Bernie and what I loved about Bernie's campaign was that Bernie had an ability to have crossover impact with all of those diverse components that most other candidates don't at all. And so, yeah, the air is being sucked out of the Democratic coalition by Gaza because it's the latest incarnation, the latest version of an issue that young people understand and that older people don't pay attention to because corporate interests, et cetera, have defined what is possible on that issue. Don't question Israel. Don't do this. Continue to sell more weapons here, send more weapons there. Ukraine, that's the consciousness of the elites. That's not the consciousness of young people at all.
I mean, I agree with you, but here's the rub. In some ways, Biden's age concerns, or I shouldn't call them age concerns because Bernie is older and we're not talking about him in the same way.
Right.
They are cognitive fitness concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Have stepped on what I see as a real pre-existing problem, and why I and many people who listen to this podcast have rejected the idea of voting for Democrats, including Biden, point blank, period. And it is because there is a real sense that there is a party support, a deep institutional, frankly, bipartisan support of a certain posture toward Israel and support of Israel. And that I do wonder if we are kind of reshuffling deck chairs on the Titanic right now when we're talking about replacing Biden, substituting in someone like Kamala Harris, who rhetorically has been softer, shall we say, or more warm, supportive, generous when talking about Palestinians, but that's rhetoric, right? The same way that was rhetoric when Biden started talking more about a ceasefire, but then said it's Hamas's fault that the ceasefire hasn't come into effect, no matter how many times Bibi Netanyahu says we're going to fight to the last Palestinian. So that being said, it does seem like that is a key issue that's been driving these polls. And coming back to the polls, this is written up in NPR in May. In a head-to-head matchup with Trump, Biden and Trump are in a statistical tie, with Biden narrowly ahead 50-48. He leads by just 4 points with voters under 45 and by 6 with Gen Zs/millennials. However, when independents RFK Jr. and Cornel West, as well as Green Party candidate Jill Stein, are introduced into the poll, Biden trails Trump by 4 points. Trump leads by 6 with Gen Z and millennials and by 8 with the under 45 group in this scenario. So I know it sounds crazy, but I was right. When all of the candidates are in the mix,
votes are going to the Kennedy, Stein, and Cornell. I mean, I think that's the point. Is that yes, Trump is
yes.
But the majority of those Gen Z voters are going to third-party candidates.
Yes. So isn't that what I take from that is, to the extent that if I'm thinking for the Democratic Party, I would take from the lesson from that as being we need to move in the direction of where those independents are on a number of issues. And it's not clear to me that anybody who got the approval of the Democratic Party to be the nominee would ever be different on policy from what Joe Biden has already demonstrated in the region.
Well, look, I'm not going to disagree with you about the fact that there's a need to have a different policy on Palestinians. Obviously, it's been my whole freaking life. I've been focused on that issue. I see Donald Trump as a great danger, and I want to stop that and do everything I can to avoid it. I do think that taking Biden out of the mix would, I think, ease some of the pressure in this election on that issue. It wouldn't solve the issue.
In a good way?
Well, here's the question. Do I expect Cornel West to win the election? Do I expect Bobby Kennedy's position on this actually is worse than Biden?
I agree 100%.
And so, and Jill Stein might have a good position, but 4% of the vote's not going to make a difference here. I mean, there are a little bit of I think seeing the landscape and what is possible, politics being the art of the possible, is what I think we have to focus on. Now, I think that you're right that Kamala Harris has not just been softer, but I think she actually gets it better. I've had a conversation with her about it. I've seen things she's gone out to say. I know that the White House has constrained her and said, you cannot say that, you need to say this instead. And I have a feeling she'd be better on the issue. Would she or the political establishment in the Democratic or Republican Party be willing to say Bibi Netanyahu or whoever replaces him if you do this, we're cutting the aid, we're stopping the flow, we're not going to support you at the UN, we're not going to punish the International Criminal Court. No, we're not there yet. We're still building the movement. We have to elect more members of Congress. We never should have let Jamal Bowman down. We need to defend Cori Bush. We need to make sure that Ilhan and Rashida and Delia and Ayanna and AOC are back in, and we have to grow those numbers. We have to defeat AIPAC and win pro-Palestinian and pro-peace candidates in order for people in positions above them to have the guts to do what they should have had the guts to do anyway. I mean, there needs to be a changing of the political ground, and we're on the way. I think we've gotten way further along than we ever were before, but we have to have a focused strategy on winning Congress and changing the political debate and giving these people the guts to do what needs to be done. Look, I remember when in the war in Vietnam, it was Pete McCloskey, a Republican Marine colonel who beat Shirley Temple in a Republican primary in '67, a special election, that helped change the debate, because Pete was a Marine colonel who ran against the war in Vietnam, and no one had ever won an election, certainly not a Republican election, being opposed to the war in Vietnam. Once he did it, people in Congress said, "Oh my God, you mean I could actually say this and do this and win?" And the tide began to change. We're still in the position of making members of Congress know that handouts to Israel, supporting genocide, is not a winning proposition. And until we look at what?
How are we letting Congress know that if we continue to support presidential candidates and candidates down the ballot who do take that position, all in the name of defeating Donald Trump?
I've never seen abstention be the recipe for victory.
Well, have you ever seen, because this is the debate we had last time you were on the show, right, Dr. Zogby? What's sort of painful to me is that I have so much respect for you in the fight that you have been fighting for decades as one of the few progressives that have ever been allowed in sort of the inner sanctum. It was on the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee, right? And you've seen things. And when you were on the show last time, and you alluded to some of this time, you talked about how much pressure you faced as a member of the inside, right? And how much antagonism and fight there is against the left. I would argue more fight than the Democratic Party ever really shows against Donald Trump or these threats to democracy, as it were. And yet the lesson I took away from you talking about your experiences last time and now is that it might be impossible to work within a party structure that fundamentally is prioritizing its own existence over everything, including the will of the people who are coming out very clearly and saying they do not want to vote for and support someone who is supporting a genocide. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder, if you've wrestled with that, thought about that at all, if now with the Lancet, one of our most respected medical journals, coming out with a new estimation of the death toll in Gaza at 186,000 people. I mean, I don't need to tell you this. As you said, you've been dedicating your whole life to this issue. If not now, at what point is it appropriate to say that the Democratic Party, if it wants to get these votes, is contingent on taking a different policy stance on this issue? And then until then, yes, we should be throwing our votes behind people like Jill Stein, that we should take the posture. You mentioned Rashida Tlaib and how long you've known her and how much you respect her. She put out a video last fall in which she pretty strongly suggested that she supported vote withholding for Joe Biden in 2024.
We stand with Israel.
Mr. President, the American people are not with you on this one.
Innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen.
I want to thank President Biden for his unequivocal support.
We will remember in 2024.
And in strong contrast to the remarks recently made this week by AOC.
Has spoken to the president over the weekend. I have spoken with him extensively. He made clear then, and he has made clear since, that he is in this race. The matter is closed. He had reiterated that this morning. He has reiterated that to the public. Joe Biden is our nominee. He is not leaving this race. He is in this race, and I support him. Now, what I think is critically important right now is that we focus on what it takes to win in November, because he is running against Donald Trump, who is a man with 34 felony convictions that has committed 34 felony crimes, and not a single Republican has asked for Donald Trump to not be the nominee. I'm here to win on this democracy. I'm here to win in November. And what's critically important is what I believe that the president needs to do, and I have communicated this, what the president and the White House should do in order to make sure that we win in November. And that is making sure that we pivot and working and increasingly commit to the issues that are critically important to working people across this country. How are we going to expand Medicare? How are we going to expand Social Security? How are we going to provide relief to people's rent and mortgages? And if we can do that and continue our work on student loans, secure a ceasefire, and bring those dollars back into investing in public policy, then that's how we win in November. That's what I'm committed to, and that's what I want to make sure that we secure.
What do you say to members done right now? I mean, what do you make of all of that?
All right. Can I tell you a story? 1968 Democratic Convention. You remember Julian Bond?
Yes.
Okay. Julian led the Georgia mixed delegation, racially mixed delegation. First time they'd had one. The sitting delegation was all white. They went to the credentials, had a fight on Monday, and Julian Bond won. And so they had a mixed delegation from Florida. Tuesday, they had a platform debate. Julian was one of the few Black leaders at the time, like King, who crossed over and was also not only civil rights, but also anti-war. And so he was one of the leaders in that effort to have the war in Vietnam be an issue. And they lost that fight. Third night was when you nominate the vice president, and delegates furious about the war, McCarthy delegates and others, and what was going on out in the streets in Chicago with the huge uprising that had occurred, the police violence of bringing the tanks in and all of that. They nominated Julian for vice president. Julian wasn't old enough to be vice president at the time, but there was a debate on the floor. That's when Daley brought the cops in and started beating up delegates. And I remember people who I knew who were sort of staid, very, traditional Democrats standing on their chairs chanting, Julian Bond, and the cops come and beating them up. The last night of the convention, Thursday, Humphrey makes his speech. Muskie, the nominated vice president, made his speech, and the balloons drop. And then from behind the stage comes Julian Bond, and he grabs Humphrey's hand and Muskie's hand and holds them up. I was devastated, frankly devastated. It's like, here was our hero, and he was endorsing and embracing these two guys who were not against the war. I didn't know him at the time, but I got to know him a few years later. And I said to him, why'd you do that? You devastated us. And he said, I agonized. He said, I thought about it. He said, but let me tell you, there are two kinds of people. There are people who sit way up on their pinnacle above the mess, and they look down at the muck of the world and they say, I'm not getting involved in that. It's got to get worse before it gets better, and I'm just going to watch it get worse. And then he said there are people who feel like they got to get down in the muck and change it, even if it's only a little bit at a time, because that's the responsibility. He said, I have to be with that camp. I can't be with the other camp. He said, at that point, it was no longer Julian Bond versus Hubert Humphrey, but it was Hubert Humphrey versus Richard Nixon. I had to make a choice, and that was the choice I made. That stuck with me.
But how did he change it? I hear Dr. Zogby, you're not the first person to come on and make this argument that everybody who objects to the status quo is sitting on the sidelines, isn't willing to work, is looking down from above it all, is too privileged to be concerned. And I got to say, that's a really triggering, frustrating argument for my audience, because they feel like they are doing the work. They are engaged in local politics.
And I'm not
They
questioning. I'm not, look, I am not questioning that what you do or what Jill Stein does or what look, when Ralph
Rashida Tlaib is doing.
When Ralph Nader ran for president in 2000, right? This is a guy who was a transformational figure in American history, clean water, clean air, safe products, whatever. Ralph Nader, I did not condemn Ralph Nader. I wouldn't condemn Ralph Nader, but I also asked Ralph Nader not to condemn me and those of us who feel that if we struggle within, that we're actually not doing anything, and that the only way to go is to abstain and stay out of the process and support candidates who can't win. I feel that we're making progress. I've never seen this many Democratic members of Congress supporting Palestinian rights. I've never seen this many members of Congress calling for fundamental change in our politics, domestic and foreign. I think what Bernie did was enormous. I'm not going to condemn him. And I certainly don't condemn Rashida. Rashida's got a district where she has earned her creds and has a constituency that will support her. But members of Congress who come from a district where they're not as secure, but who are good on X number of issues, I'm not going to resent them for taking positions that are a little more temperate.
But I don't know that's really the issue.
I'm of the Mao school of let 1,000 flowers bloom. Many paths to the same goal. We want fundamental change. The question is, how do we get there? And my way of getting there is to try to figure out, how do we change the dynamic within the Democratic? How do I empower the Democratic Party members to become decision-making and to take control of this process? How do I change the party platform? I've gone to testify before party platforms 11 different times now over the last 44 years since I first started working with Jesse Jackson. People call me Charlie Brown on the football. They call me Sisyphus. But when they say, why do you keep doing it? I say, because it's there. And what am I going to do? I mean, do I just ignore the fact that this is an issue there, that if I have an opportunity to educate some people in the process, if I have an opportunity to change some minds, even if I don't change the platform, if some people come away saying, he made a compelling case, this is really important, I have to pay attention here, then I've accomplished something. And yeah, look, have I changed the Democratic Party? No. But have I impacted some people along my 50 years of doing this work who say, I think differently about this now? Then I've done something. And that's all I can do. I can't do more than that.
I think, Dr. Zogby, from my perspective, and I think maybe from the perspective of some people who are listening, I think what is frustrating is that it's clear how valuable you are in terms of your knowledge base and your commitment to advocacy and public work for all of these years. And when you raise the question, well, what could I do in the alternative? I think, as someone who has seen how hard it is to get good people to staff independent grassroots campaigns, the struggle that Bernie had to hire good people, the struggle that the Jill Stein campaign and others have to hire good people, the kind of mismanagement that seems to have been the death knell of the Cornel West campaign and going from MPP to Green to independent, all of this stuff. I think having people like you on board, having someone like Dennis Kucinich, who I admire so much, working with someone like Jill Stein as opposed to starting off with someone like RFK Jr. I mean, I think we all fantasize about a dream team being put together that could start to really put real pressure on the party, the kind of pressure that forced the Democratic Party under FDR to become the most progressive version of itself that we've ever seen, not because they just spontaneously decided to, but because there was a real outside communist and socialist push that was popular and was popularizing ideas the Democratic Party was forced to accept. Looking at it just from a power analysis, I am really at a loss for why the Democratic Party, that controls everything, would ever concede to any demands made from the inside or the outside unless they were forced to. And I have a hard time understanding how that would happen if ultimately the ask is for everyone to continue to support the Democratic Party no matter what, because there's always a Republican Party that's worse.
Yeah. Look, I can't disagree that you lay out a case of the difficulties that we face. And I know them up close personal. I mean, I've dealt with them when I got started in this work in the 1970s with the Palestine Human Rights Campaign. We tried to get membership in the Coalition for a New Foreign Policy because the building that I was in had the Salvadorian and the Filipino and all of these various, Latin American support groups and Asian, whatever, it was anti-war groups. Everybody was in that building. And they said, you should join the coalition. I said, yeah. So I applied for membership, won the vote. 3 Jewish groups came and said, if you let Zogby in, we're going to pull out and it would be the death of your coalition. They asked me to withdraw. 2 years later, I applied again, won the vote again. Same thing happened. March on Washington, 1983, the 20th anniversary. We were on the National Steering Committee. Jewish groups complained, if you let the Arabs in, we're pulling out. They don't belong in the civil rights movement. We do. We were historic, whatever. We had a knockdown, drag out fight. Thank God for Reverend Jackson and Walter Fauntroy and Joe Lowery, who took our side. Others were weak-kneed and said, they should leave. We had a fight for every damn seat at the table. Every damn seat at the table. And frankly, when I walk in the room, and people know where I come, you think when I'd walk in the room at a Democratic National Committee meeting, executive committee with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, that she didn't give me the eye, that I was there? And when I wanted to support something, and there were people who would prefer me not there. And I am not going to give them the gratification of seeing me out. Jesse Jackson told me one time, I got so frustrated. I said, I'm going to quit. He said, do not quit. If you quit, you give them exactly what they want. What they're most afraid of is that you stick around and fight. Because when you walk in the room, they get nervous because they know you got a better argument to make. They know you have a stronger case. They're afraid of it. That's why they want to keep silencing you. They silence you because they don't want to hear it and they don't want others to hear it. That Columbia firing people and bogus charges of anti-Semitism. They made cheap shots of vomit emoji on a text message. Not anti-Semitism. It was crude and stupid and childish. But that's not grounds for firing somebody. The effort is they know they're losing the debate. They want us not to talk. So they will penalize us talking. I'm not leaving the Democratic Party because I'm going to stay and fight them every step of the way. And that's what I do. I presented testimony at the platform. And I told them, I said, you're not going to listen to me. You never do. I've been doing this for 40 years. But here is what is happening in Gaza. And here's what you need to say. And if you don't, you're failing your historic responsibility. I have the ability to do that. I'm not giving that up. And I'm not giving it up to support a campaign that's a joyride for somebody who feels pure and will get 4% of the vote. And, because I do feel in my heart that as problematic as I find the current administration to be in its foreign policy and as inadequate in some ways in its domestic policy, even though it's made some real progress in some areas, I'm afraid of Donald Trump being back in the White House again. Desperately afraid of that. And I do not want to see that happen. And I will do whatever I can to make sure that he's not in the White House, because it's not just about me. It's about my kids and my grandkids and about a whole lot of other people who will pay a very dear price if that guy gets back near the realm,
Yeah. I know what you mean.
So
Dr. Zogby, so much of what you said really resonates with me. To your last point, I would just say, I'm concerned that a failure to hold the Democratic Party genuinely accountable by forcing it away from the politics that are making it so unpopular.
You don't think I tried to do that?
No, I know that you are trying to do that.
It bounced me from the executive committee because I put forward resolutions holding them accountable and demanding transparency on budget matters. They didn't want to deal with that. They didn't want to deal with that because, frankly, I'll tell you what's happened is that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are no longer political organizations. They are fundraising vehicles for consultants. They raise the money, they give it to consultants, and the consultants, there's like 6 or 7 of them approved groups that get the money, billions in every 4-year cycle. They never lose an election, these guys. They never lose an election because they make their money. So they don't really care. I mean, they send out these stupid emails and these stupid digital ads that nobody pays attention to that make no damn difference at all, but they make their money. And so those of us who are elected, or those of us who represent constituencies who serve on the DNC, what I'm trying to do is make them feel you need to be empowered to say enough. We need budget transparency. We need accountability. We need to fulfill the bylaws of the party that say that annually the DNC should review the budget and evaluate the effectiveness of staff and expenditures. They don't do that. But the party needs to do that. And that's what I'm there to do, is challenge them every day.
I completely get that. But let me tell you, I'm here with you in this space because it's when I say it resonates with me, this is something I've been wrestling with very deeply for a very long time. I thought about this at Rising. I agree. I came to the same conclusion that you did. They clearly want me to be gone. I don't want to quit. Let me force them to at very least do it so they can reveal themselves for who they are, even though it was very difficult for me to be there since October 7th. It was the fight behind the cameras was 1,000-fold what you ever saw me and Robbie disagree with on camera, right? But I came to the same conclusion you did. I have told a story recently on this podcast about a lecture that I viewed when I was in law school about a former prosecutor and a progressive prosecutor who was still a prosecutor, about whether or not you could be a progressive Black prosecutor in the space and not simply just kind of affirm and validate an unequal criminal justice system. And one guy came to the conclusion of working inside, and one guy said, after working inside for many years, I realized that I was part of a problem. And they came to very different conclusions. And, over and over again, people are wrestling with this question. And I think it's context specific. I've been thinking about it as I've been watching these press conferences and see journalists like my former colleague Niall Stanage and, Sam Husseini and others really press Biden officials on the hypocrisy, the inconsistencies between how they address Russian bombings in Ukraine versus Israel's bombing of hospitals and civilian centers in Palestine, and really have them on the ropes. But the administration spokespeople just say the same old thing over and over again. There's differences because, and we're investigating it, and I'll tell you about it 2 years later. And I found myself wondering, at what point do even the journalists, are we all participating in some fiction of there being accountability from the Biden administration when we go through the pantomime of this being a press conference when you never get any real answers about anything? And at what point is it better just for everyone to stand up, turn their backs, and say, we're not doing this anymore. We're not asking you questions when we know we're going to get lies. We're just going to report on your lies. I mean, I really don't know the answer to these questions, right? But I do feel a dissonance. I feel a dissonance when we watch the 1,000th press conference where, John Kirby or Matt Miller stands up there and just lies bald-facedly and gets to have the imprimatur of truth because they're standing behind the podium and they're going through this pantomime. And so that's why I'm asking you, you say, at least I'm here, at least I'm in the game, at least I have the possibility of making an impact where Jill Stein doesn't, because she's only going to earn 4% of the vote. Well, Dr. Zogby, what if she earned 5% and got $20 million in federal matching funds and some of the grist to start to try to really build an insurgent party?
All power to her. I'm not denying it. Like I said, I'm not denying it. I'm not saying she shouldn't do it or you shouldn't do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to join that because I have a different path. And I feel my path is the right path, and your path you feel is the right path. And I respect you for it. And frankly, wouldn't be doing this with you right now if I didn't know. If it didn't feel.
I really do appreciate that.
Here's the point. That there are multiple. Yeah. Look, there are reporters who will walk away, and there are reporters who will stick around and keep fighting. And I actually love it when I watch the AP guy or Saeed Erekat from Palestine pushing them and making them feel so goddamn uncomfortable, and then ending up getting us clips that make it clear that they've got them on the ropes, and these guys are just lying through their teeth. They've done an enormous service to us in the process, and so there is an inside role and an outside role. I like what groups like Intercept do and what FAIR does, and I like what the guys who sit there in those State Department briefings and must go nuts every day dealing with it. Just like I go nuts dealing with sometimes stuff you have to do inside the party. But frankly, there's a role. If our goal is the same, we don't need to be knocking each other as much as we need to be reinforcing what we want, which is fundamental change in how this works.
I agree, but I would say that I don't think it's about knocking each other. I mean, Rashida Tlaib, for instance, is making a strategic determination when she does something like, say in this campaign video or whatever it was, that, affirms the validity of withholding one's vote for Biden unless he changes his policy on Palestine. Mm-hmm. And it's one that I happen to agree with, but it's not about whether or not you disagree or agree. Like, I'm less interested in whether or not you would knock her for it or, put her down as a person, which obviously you don't want to do for many reasons, but whether or not you actually agree with
for years. That's why.
Right. Well, yes, that's what I mean by reasons. Yeah. Like, because you like her and you know her and you respect her. Right. But do you respect that strategic choice?
That's her choice. And does she respect it? And I hope she does. It's her choice, and I respect it, and I hope she respects mine. We play a different game here. But do
you think it's strategically viable? Because I don't think that what Rashida Tlaib is saying is, I want Trump to win. Of course, she's saying that I want Biden to win, and this is what is required for him to do it. But and this is the only leverage I have. This is the only pressure I have to make him change.
Mm-hmm. Good. I respect that for her. It's not for me.
All right. I won't beat this dead horse anymore. Quick before we leave, I just want to ask you, what do you think the odds are of Biden actually stepping down and releasing us delegates?
I don't want to give Joe Biden look like a deer in the headlights. I don't. Frankly, I don't know. I would if it doesn't happen this week, it probably won't happen unless there's another flub. The point is that there will be flubs.
Oh, but there will be flubs.
There have to be. But I think that the heat is on now, and knowing the press and weak-kneed politicians as I do, if it doesn't happen soon, I think it'll be too late 2 weeks from now for him to drop out. And they'll do everything they can to shield him from more flubs. There won't be any more debates. There'll be a lot of opportunities to control. I mean, look, the guy's using teleprompters in people's living rooms when he meets with small. There's a problem here. Damn it, they need to own up to the fact that there's a problem and put an end to this. It almost feels like abusive to continue to. And I understand when he says, when he feels strongly and attached to it. Old folks get feisty. I get feisty. But this is not, it's not working. It's not working for him. It's not working for the country or for the party. And I frankly think that I'd like to see a decision made sooner than later so that we have time to implement a process. What I didn't want to see happen is that he steps down and just hands it off to Kamala, which I don't think is fair to her. Don't think it's fair to the country or to the party. It would not be as genuine as if there were a contested process and she won it. That was my thing.
But are you concerned that she might not win it? Because one other thing is that there's this question of who can get the money that's already been fundraised. And my understanding is that part of why Kamala is like a preferred choice is not just that she's VP, but that she would still be able to access those funds. Is that right?
Look, Jesse used to say, when he'd come and he'd say, I need to get this, get the lawyer, tell me how to do it. The lawyer would come and say, Reverend, it can't be done. Reverend would say, I didn't ask you to tell me if I could do it. I asked you to tell me how I can do it. That $200 million that's in that fund, that can go anywhere ultimately that the lawyers figure out. It'll go, some of it to the party, some of it can go to create a political PAC, Victory 24. They can do anything with it that they want And there are ways around every law that exists in campaign finance. We've already seen that, right? And so if that's the main reason, that's a pretty shitty reason. It's a really weak case here.
So then the follow-up then is, do you think that Kamala would actually be successful? I mean, is there some risk, assuming that, assuming that you seem to think that it should be Kamala, opening it up presents some uncertainty, no?
There's no perfect candidate right now. I'd love Bernie. I wish Bernie would do it. I was with Bernie a couple of weeks ago, and I said to myself, there's Biden old and there's Bernie old. Like the Bernie one is smart as a tack. I mean, sharp as a tack, and able to put complex thoughts in a conceptual framework that just make clear sense to everybody. But when we talk about Joe Biden's agenda and how successful he's been domestically, it is because he mirrored a lot of what Bernie wanted to do and agreed to do it in his first couple of years when they still had control of Congress. But there's so much more that could be done and should be done. And I don't have a perfect candidate who can do it right now. What I'm looking for is not a perfect candidate, but somebody to beat Donald Trump. And
let's stay with Biden. Let's stay with Bernie for a second, because we all know from the Bernie team that he was up 10 points on Trump in a way that Hillary can never muster, that he was up more on Trump in 2020 than Biden was, that he is that candidate for you. So when you say, I wish it were Bernie, but it's not going to be, how much of that is because you don't think Bernie is willing? How much of that do you think is because the party wouldn't allow it? And why do you think that?
Bernie doesn't want to do it. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want to do it. He's running for Senate, running for re-election, and he is being loyal right now to the president and sees him as the best choice. He does. But it wasn't so much the party didn't want, but remember, the first outing of the Democratic majority for Israel was going after Bernie in 2020. That was the first campaign that they played in, that dark money super PAC. And they started the ads in Iowa, and it grew, the crescendo grew. And then when he finally won Nevada, it was just constant ads about he's too old, he's a socialist, we're going to lose down ballot tickets, he's this, he's that, and then MSNBC and all the rest started picking up that message, and then we went to South Carolina and Clyburn echoing the same message. Bernie got defeated.
I got to make one other point.
Yeah.
So the president talked today about how now it's all the elites who are trying to force him out.
Right.
Let's remember what happened in 2020. Okay. The president did not run a great primary campaign. He lost badly in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. He came out of Nevada, and Bernie Sanders looked like the presumptive nominee. And this exact same group of people,
the elites,
that the president is now deriding as elites. And by the way, they're not. They're Democrats. Okay. They're party operatives, they're donors, they're volunteers, decided, and to all the Bernie supporters out there, I'm not judging this positively or negatively, they decided they didn't want Bernie Sanders to be the nominee. They decided that Joe Biden would be the better nominee, and credit again to the president. He decided that because he did 8 years as vice president. He did the years in the Senate. He had the record to be a strong president. And so they, through their support behind Joe Biden, and Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Mike Bloomberg and Amy Klobuchar, and I may be forgetting a few others, stepped aside for the candidate who was better. This myth that somehow Joe Biden came in and rescued us, it has been a nationwide movement since Donald Trump was elected president. And in 2020, that nationwide movement said, Joe, you're the best guy, let's go. Right now, they don't think he is.
And then we had COVID, which sucked the energy out of the whole campaign. And Super Tuesday in the South again played Bernie as somehow an extremist who could never win. I think he could have won, should have won, and would have been the best candidate. But he's not. And so we got to deal with what we got. And we don't have another Bernie on the scene.
So what I would say, I will speak for me, not for you. I find it to be very frustrating and disappointing that Bernie might think that Biden is the best candidate to beat Trump when he knows firsthand that he's not. But second of all, speaking of Clyburn, I think what you just laid out there as the history of what happened in 2020 is completely accurate. But Clyburn has been all over the place since the debate in terms of what he said about backing Biden. He went, I'm reading a tweet by Lindsey Ballin. He says, Clyburn's gone from Biden had a rough night, but he's our nominee, to I'd support Kamala if he steps down, to, oh yeah, you could totally do a mini primary before the convention, all within the span of 3 days. It does seem like he is open to the idea of having a mini primary, and somebody who is as insidery as Clyburn, even alluding to the possibility, does seem to suggest it is a real possibility.
Yeah. And I took note about Clyburn, but I have to say one thing I did take note of was the word insidery. I love it. Thank you. Coined a new word. I'm going to use it. And somebody as insidery as Clyburn.
I'm happy to help. But so you, I mean, we come back to this kind of like closing question of what do you think the odds are that Biden is in fact going to step down and we're going to have a different nominee?
I don't know. I didn't. I was more certain a week ago that it would happen this week, when after the debate and then after the Stephanopoulos interview, which was supposed to tamp down the concern and actually accelerated the concern. And I'm afraid that he's put down a marker so firm that it's going to be difficult to budge him. And if he doesn't move, others, I think, will be restrained from moving. But if we see the continued drip, drip, drip with more Democrats saying, I don't want this, if the numbers continue to grow, then the pressure might be on him enough to drop out. Even though he says, I'm sticking the course and I'm not doing it and I defy you to do it. I remember George McGovern saying that about Senator Eagleton. I'm 1,000% behind him. And the next day dropped him. This can change on a dime.
I keep saying this, that the Obama tweet that was like, yeah, we got to stick with Joe Biden, didn't actually say we should stick with Joe Biden. When you read the words of the tweet, it says we have to stick with the Democratic candidate, the Democratic nominee. We've got to defeat Trump. And then at the end, it says Joe Biden 2024. But nowhere in the tweet does it actually say we've got to rally behind this guy in particular. And my concern, my fear is that what we're actually seeing is Joe Biden staying in long enough to basically preclude there being any primary and to make it so that it really can be picked in smoke-filled rooms.
That was my concern. And that's why when I issued the plan, I was hoping that it would happen early July, so that we'd be in the position of having a process that would be open, transparent, and democratic. The longer it takes, the more difficult, and the prospect of it being a hand down, which like I said, I don't think would be a benefit to Kamala herself. I don't think it would be a benefit to the party or the country. The perception of it would not be what we want. We want to see something generate excitement. We want to see something create a sense that this was a real process. And the longer it takes for the president to do it, if he does it at all, then the more difficult it will be to have that process.
Yeah, which might be the plan. All right, Dr. Zogby, I'm going to let you go. I know you have a lot ahead of you today, and I really appreciate you spending all of this time in your incredible and unmatched expertise. You are, if anything, my favorite insider to stay with this insidery theme, because it's very rare, as you've explained to us on this episode and the last one, for someone with your politics who is a genuine progressive to be allowed inside some of these smoke-filled rooms and have the opportunity to at least try to influence the choices that are made therein. So I really do appreciate you sharing your experiences with us and spending the time with us today on this podcast.
And I respect you. Thank you so much. You're a courageous speaker. Take care.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say. Before you go, is there anything you want to direct listeners to? Any Substacks, anything you've written, any
My
organizations
column, I've been writing a weekly column that's in 12 countries, mostly in the Middle East. They can get it by writing to JZOGBY at aaiusa.org. Or they can DM me or follow me on Twitter at JJZ1600.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you again. Thank you to all of you for tuning in to this episode. A reminder that if you want an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and find those episodes released on Mondays. Additionally, if you do subscribe already to Bad Faith YouTube, note that a good portion of the clips of the premium episodes are posted on Mondays. But if you're wondering why those interviews seem to end abruptly or seem not to be complete, it's because those are just clips of premium episodes. So if you like what you're seeing, go ahead and subscribe over at Patreon and you can listen to or watch those episodes in full. All right. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.